Today we are still going to be talking about our sine and cosine graphs that we talked about yesterday. We're still going to be working with the amplitude, the period, and the shape for those two graphs alone today. What we're going to do differently than yesterday is our graphs are going to move around a little bit. So instead of having the middle line right at the x-axis, that middle line might be shifted up or down. And instead of having our starting place be right at the y-axis, that starting line might be shifted side to side. Also, our graphs could be flipped upside down. We've talked about function shifting earlier this year and how we can look at whether it's going to move side to side or up and down. And one of the nice things about functions is no matter what kind of function it is, they all behave exactly the same way in terms of how they move around. So we're going to build off of those same ideas. So in this one, we're going to want to think about our amplitude and period again. The amplitude is always the number that is multiplied. The problem is 3. Our period is 2 pi divided by b, and b is the number that is right multiplied by the x. So that is 4, and our period is pi over 2. So we use the 3, we use the 4. The thing that we haven't used is this negative 2. So we learned earlier that the entire of it or in the back of it, if it's added and subtracted to the entire function, that is a vertical shift, and it does what it says it does. So this is going to move our middle line down 2 spots. So instead of the middle being right on the x-axis, our middle is going to be down 2 spots. This is our sine graph. So like yesterday we talked about our shapes of them and their 5 key points. Sine goes middle up, middle down, middle. I'm still going to start my y-axis pretty close over here. I'm going to move my x-axis more up towards the top of this grid, though, to give me room to move this thing downwards 2 spots like we're supposed to. For scaling, I'm still going to take 3 lines of paper and flip it on its side and call it a pi. And going out to pi is actually far enough, because yesterday we talked about how we wanted to go enough so we could fit in 2 cycles of it, and the period length is pi halves. So going out to pi is actually enough to fit in those 2 pi halves. And this one's going to be really squishy side to side. Then before we begin plotting any points, we want to take care of that shift downward by 2. So what we're going to do is make a line down 2 spots. It didn't really show up. Changing our color here. We're going to make a line down 2 spots, and that's going to be our new middle. Okay. It's not really a part of the graph, so don't make it like you make your axis. Okay, I still need to see like distinctly an x-axis and a y-axis. This line is just kind of a guideline for us now that that's going to be our new middle.
The line you just draw again.
The red one, yep, is going to be the new middle line. So then we're ready to plot points, and sine begins in the middle, so it's going to begin on that new middle line. At the end of one period, it is back in the middle, and our period is only pi halves, so that is not over very far. And halfway between those, it's in the middle again. Between its first 2 middles, it has an up, and the amplitude is 3. In between the second 2 middles, it has its down, and it goes down 3. So this is a very, very squishy one here. And just like yesterday, I would still like to see 2 cycles as long as 2 will fit on your paper, and 2 of this will definitely fit. Remember, we should have arrows at the end of it there to show that it goes on forever doing the same thing over and over and over. We only do 2 of them, but we could draw lots of them.
So why is that red line in the middle?
The -2 that's added to the front of the equation takes the middle line and moves it down 2 spots.
Does that apply to cosine too?
Yep. Anything that's added or subtracted to the equation is going to move our line up or down, whether it's sine or cosine. All right, so let's look at another one. Our amplitude is always what's multiplied in front of our trig function. The period is 2 pi divided by b, and b is the number that is by x, so that's pi. 2 pi divided by pi cancels the pi's, and we just get a period length of 2. And that 3 that's in the front being added to the function, it's a positive 3, so our graph's going to go up 3 spots for its middle line on this one. This one is a cosine, so its pattern is going to be up, middle, down, middle, up. To give me room to move this thing up, I'm going to put my axis down a little bit lower here instead of centered. And then for our scaling, instead of taking 3 lines of a paper and calling it a pi, we don't care where pi is. The period is just 2. So I'm going to take 2 lines of paper and flip it over and call it a 2. Then before we plot points, we need to do that shifting. This one's going to go up 3 lines to create the new middle. And again, I'm just doing that with like a really faint red line because it's not actually a part of the graph, it's just a guideline. So don't draw it in really dark, like as dark as your axes. It's just there to guide us. It's not actually a part of the graph. Then we're ready to plot points. Cosine starts in the up position. The amplitude is a half. It's going to start up a half above the middle line. At the end of its period, which is a length of 2, it should be up again. And halfway between, it's down. Between those, it has to cross through the middle line. So we get this. We do the same set of 5 points to get a second cycle. Remember on cosine to make sure that those tails at the end are pointed downward because it never goes up above those highest points. So we don't want those arrows to point up. Questions? Okay, there's 2 ways we can move our graphs around. We can move them up and down, or we can move them side to side. Oh, mine looks all ugly. Okay, I'll rewrite it. Okay. First thing we want to think about is our amplitude. The amplitude is going to be the number multiplied in front of the trig function. So our amplitude is going to be 2. The period is going to be 2 pi divided by b, where b is what's multiplied by x. What's multiplied by x?
2/3.
The 2/3. It's on the outside of the parentheses, but we would distribute into parentheses, so that 2/3 is really being multiplied by that x. So that's our b value. How do I divide by 2/3? Multiply by 3 over 2. So this ends up then giving us a period length of 3 pi. So the thing in the equation that we haven't done anything yet is that it says minus pi fourths. This is in a different location than the adding and subtracting was before because it's grouped in parentheses with the x. Okay? In the last problems, that thing that was added could have been added in the front of the equation or the back of the equation. It doesn't really matter. But when the parentheses are combining that thing with the x, it's collected there together in a group, that's going to be a sideways shift. And we've learned earlier this year that when we have those sideways shifts, they actually go backwards. So this is going to go to the right pi fourths. So this is going to move our starting line. Instead of starting right at the y-axis, we're going to bump our starting place over a little bit. This is a cosine graph, so it's going to go up, middle, down, middle, up. Need to go out to 6 pi so that I have enough. Now to do our shifting, we're supposed to move this thing to the right a pi fourths. So we need to know where pi fourths is. Pi fourths is the same thing as 1/4 of pi. So I need to take that pi and I need to divide it into 4 pieces. And we are going to shift over one of those pieces. Not a very straight line, but we'll go with it. That's going to be our starting line. Okay, so instead of starting right on the y-axis, we're going to start at that line.
Why is that?
Because of that x minus pi fourths in the equation. That moves our graph. The whole thing is just going to bump over a pi fourths to the right. Now what that means is, since our starting line bumped over, all of our other markings really need to bump over as well. So in terms of our plotting our points, when I think about going out to 3 pi to end the cycle, because I still want a width of 3 pi between my starting point and my ending point. So I don't want to put my ending point right at 3 pi, I want to put it just a little bump beyond. And same thing with all the other ones. All of the things are going to bump over that same pi fourths. So then to plot our points, cosine starts in the up position. So on that new starting line, we're going to start up 2. Cosine ends in the up position. The period is 3 pi, but I'm not going to put it above where I wrote 3 pi. I'm going to put it above the bump of where I bumped over 3 pi. Halfway between those is going to be our down. And halfway between those is going to be our middles. You can just kind of eyeball where the halfways are. I'm not going to make you work out all the fractions to figure out exactly where all those centers should be. But you can just kind of eyeball and gauge where the centers are going to be. And then we want to repeat that cycle one more time, again, above where we bumped 6 pi over to, not above the original 6 pi. Questions? I think moving the starting line is harder than moving the middle line because we have to kind of take care of all of our rescaling then and kind of adjust everything that we had written out. So I think moving that starting line is a harder thing than just moving the middle line. Alright, once again, mine looks kind of weird. Actually, did it even change?
No, it didn't.
Oh, now it did. Now it's going to change too many times. Yep. Okay. All right, so first thing we want to think about is our amplitude. The amplitude is the number that is multiplied in front of the trig function, so the amplitude is 4. The period is 2 pi divided by whatever x is multiplied by. So x is multiplied in this problem by 3. And our period is 2 pi thirds. That's really tiny. The thing that we haven't done anything with is that plus pi thirds. It's happening in parentheses with the x, so it's going to be a sideways movement. And sideways movement goes backwards, so this thing is going to go to the left a pi thirds. Okay, outside of the parentheses, the movement will be up or down, and it does what it says. Inside of parentheses, it's side to side, and it goes backwards from what it says. And since we're doing a sign, we're going to do a middle up, middle down, middle. I'm going to start my y-axis over a little bit more on this problem so that I have room to go out on the left-hand side, since I'm going to have to bump this thing over to the left. Also, with a really tiny period length, I don't really need tons of room over there to be able to fit 2 cycles in. So I'm going to take 3 lines of paper and tip it and call it a pi. And I'm also going to do that same thing and go backwards to make a negative pi, since we have to shift backwards. We're supposed to shift backwards a pi thirds, so we need to take this pi that we just drew out and cut it into 3 pieces. And I want to shift backwards one of those pieces to make my new starting line. I'm also going to cut the other pi into thirds as well. Since kind of everything in this problem is measured in thirds, with our period length of being 2 pi thirds and the shift of being pi thirds, I'm going to cut everything into thirds. Okay, we're doing a sine graph, so that starts in the middle position. And we're going to start on that new starting line, not right on the axis, but on where we... At the end of one period length, sine should be back in the middle. The period length is 2 pi thirds, and each little marking that we have on our axis represents 1 pi thirds. So we need to go over 2 of those markings. And that's a 2 pi thirds length to make a full period. Halfway between, it should be back in the middle. Halfway between the first 2, it's up, and it's supposed to be up a height of 4. I don't have 4 lines, so I'm just going to kind of float it up there. And same thing with the down. We're supposed to fit in 2, so I'm going to repeat this same thing, over 2 pi thirds for the end of a cycle, over 1 mark for the middle, up and down. Questions? The one other change that we can make to a graph is to have a negative with our A value. Our amplitude is always going to be a positive number. Okay? Amplitude is defined as being the absolute value of A. It's the height, and we're always going to think about height as being a positive value. The period is going to be 2 pi divided by B. There's nothing by the x, so the period is just going to be 2 pi. What's going to change because of this negative is our graph is going to flip upside down. So normally, sine has a pattern of middle up, middle down, middle. What that negative does is it comes in and it makes all the ups downs and all the downs ups. Right? It's just taking the entire graph and flipping it upside down. So the middle's still the middle, but up becomes down and down becomes up. I'm going to go to 4 pi on this one so that I can fit it in 2 cycles. So now according to our new pattern, sine still starts in the middle, and it still ends in the middle, and it's still middle in the center. But between the first 2 middles, it has its down. And between the second 2, it has its up. Then I'm going to do the same thing one more time. Your amplitude should still be positive. We always want a positive answer for our amplitude. So even though that negative is there, we're still going to report our amplitude as being a positive 3 because it still has a height of 3. But that negative goes in and it changes all the ups, downs, and non-stops. And that's the same for sine or for cosine. Questions? All right. Change too many. Okay. There we go. All right. So on this one, what's our amplitude going to be? Positive 1. There's only that negative out front. The negative doesn't affect the amplitude. So there's really just a 1 in front of there. The period is going to be 2 pi divided by 4, which is going to be pi over 2. This is a cosine graph, so normally it does an up, middle, down, middle, up. But this negative here is going to go through and change all of our ups to downs and our downs to ups. I only need to go out to pi on this one because our period length is just pi halves. So going out to pi gives me enough room to fit both of them in. Because our cosine is flipped, it's going to start in the down position. So it's going to start down at 1. At pi halves, it'll be down again. And halfway between, it'll be up. And it'll cross through the middles between there. And then repeat that pattern one more time. I missed my phone.
So it's going to be going up this time to this way. It's going to continue to go up this time instead of going
Yes. Yeah, so it'll continue to go up. So just like before, we wanted to make sure those tails were pointed down. Here we want to make sure our tails are pointed up. All right, and your homework is from section 14.2 tonight.